She's working on a book called Child of Empire. And one of the things that, we both talked about is how, her beloved mother, that, even though she felt completely loved, there was always a place at some point that she knew her mother understood her as different, as other, and that was because of race. Even President Obama mentioned it in his speech on race, in which he's talking about his beloved white grandmother, and he gets to the moment in the speech and he says, but nonetheless. It's the nonetheless. I kind of went off on a tangent about that, but I want to bring it back to say that those are difficult conversations, and you would think that because of the difficulty of our ongoing conversations about race in America, that it could be contentious or difficult. And yet, that's not what I've encountered thus far. And one of the things that has made me feel safer even to continue the work I must do is that I meet people all the time, who will come up and say, that they hadn't thought about a certain thing, or that, the ways that poems not only help us reckon with our shared and deeply difficult past, but they also help us to imagine a better world. They help us to imagine a more just and humane society that we are every day working together to build. And so because of that, because it's in the language of poetry, that the elegant envelope of a poem, it makes listening a little easier. It makes listening a little bit more desirable. And I also feel like, the Librarian of Congress has read my books. He knows exactly what I'm talking about. And he wouldn't have installed me in this post if he didn't think, I think also, that it was a conversation worth having and that maybe the poems were the way to have it. And so I feel empowered to continue to do the work that I do because of it.
I want to ask you to read the poem Enlightenment before.
It's a good time to read that, actually. I've been talking so much about it. The poem I'm going to read is actually probably about the last poem that I wrote for the book, and I knew that I had to write it. You know how that is? Like, there's a poem you got to write or the book's not going to come together. And so in order to write it, I knew that I had to take my father to Monticello. My father took me to Monticello the first time over 20 years ago. And, things were obviously different in these many years since we'd been there last. And the main difference is that it is now the official position of the Jefferson Foundation that Thomas Jefferson fathered at least 2 of Sally Hemings' children. That changes some of the conversations that you overhear when you're at Monticello as well. So now that we've acknowledged that, there are different things to then discuss. And my father, because he is someone, deeply committed to the Enlightenment, and the first person who started getting me to read, some of the Enlightenment scholars that he was interested in, from Kant to Jefferson, we've also debated these things over the years, because once I started to read them, I began also to see those controversial and more contentious ideas about race and racial difference, which made me say, okay, Enlightenment. In the portrait of Jefferson that hangs at Monticello, he is rendered two-toned, his forehead white with illumination, a lit bulb, the rest of his face in shadow, darkened as if the artist meant to contrast his bright knowledge, its dark subtext. By 1805, when Jefferson sat for the portrait, he was already linked to an affair with his slave. Against a backdrop blue and ethereal, a wash of paint that seems to hold him in relief, Jefferson gazes out across the centuries, his lips fixed as if he's just uttered some final word. The first time I saw the painting, I listened as my father explained the contradictions, how Jefferson hated slavery, though out of necessity, my father said, had to own slaves. that his moral philosophy meant he could not have fathered those children, would have been impossible, my father said. For years, we debated the distance between word and deed. I'd follow my father from book to book, gathering citations, listen as he named, like a field guide to Virginia, each flower and tree and bird, as if to prove a man's pursuit of knowledge is greater than his shortcomings, the limits of his vision. I did not know then the subtext of our story, that my father could imagine Jefferson's words made flesh in my flesh, the improvement of the blacks in body and mind in the first instance of their mixture with the whites, or that my father could believe he'd made me better. When I think of this now, I see how the past holds us captive, its beautiful ruin etched on the mind's eye. My young father, a rough outline of the old man he's become, needing to show me the better measure of his heart, an equation writ large at Monticello. That was years ago. Now we take in how much has changed. Talk of Sally Hemings, someone asking, how white was she? Parsing the fractions as if to name what made her worthy of Jefferson's attentions, a near white quadroon mistress, not a plain black slave. Imagine stepping back into the past, our guide tells us then, and I can't resist whispering to my father, this is where we split up. I'll head around to the back. When he laughs, I know he's grateful I've made a joke of it, this history that links us, white father, black daughter, even as it renders us other to each other.
There's so much to say about the poem. The first thing I want to say has to do with the fact that the entry into the poem has to do with the portrait. And there's something about the world of visual art that seems to really invite you to imagine stories and derive insights. Can you talk about that a little bit? We have, the photographs that, not only the photographs that run through your first book, Domestic Work, but also the photographs that drive Philopsophilia and the paintings that you focus on in several poems in Thrall.
It seems to me that I've always been very visual, that is the image, the type of image that is strongest or most strongly developed in me, or the one I'm at least most consciously attuned to. When I was growing up, I would try to memorize the way that my grandmother's house looked, because I missed her deeply when I had to leave Mississippi at the end of the summer to go back to Atlanta. And I wanted to keep the image of the place in my head. And so I began to do that all the time, to make pictures of what it is I was trying to keep in the way that memory does that for us. And so it seemed quite natural for me to want to begin always with the given image and to move from there. So with photographs, for me it is to begin there in some ways in description, and to move then to imagining what's happened just before or just after a photograph, to imagine what is being left out of the frame, the kinds of erasures that I'm interested in, what's been cropped, what about the perspective makes us see it differently than we might also see it if we look through a slightly different lens. And it's the same way, I think, for me with paintings. I mean, paintings also have those kinds of perspectives and cropping and framing, and they also function in a kind of documentary way to me, the way photographs do. They present as material culture, a particular moment in history, the way the artist saw things, as well as the ways that the viewers, for example, in some of the 18th century paintings that I've written about, the way the people who saw it might have understood what was being represented there and how that reflected their own lives. And so, you know, I love to start there. And even when I'm not actually looking at a photograph or a painting, I always start with a picture in my head before I can write a word.
I love the way that the poem, is it called Juan Pareja?
Yes.
And maybe that's another one that you would read if you don't mind. Creates a sense of his understanding of himself by way of how he is depicted, and then the distance between his father, or rather the painter and the canvas, and then
it is almost his father there,
yeah,
isn't it?
and then the agency with which he begins to paint on his own. And somehow that feels analogous to the relationship to history that you're thinking about, and that we can also imagine the subjects of the other of your poems, even if they're not subjects of visual art, like the Native Guard soldiers who write the beautiful letters in your.
You know, the thing about that Velázquez painting of Juan de Pareja that was so amazing to me when I saw it, when I was working on Thrall, I was trying to search for images of representations of Africans in visual art across several centuries, you know, from the Renaissance, you know, to colonial Mexico. And that's one of the paintings that I came across. And so I started to read a little bit about Velázquez and Pareja and their relationship, because Pareja was a slave of Velázquez's before he manumitted him. And Velázquez famously painted that portrait of Juan de Pareja in order to practice for a painting that he was going to make of the Pope. And people praise the painting tremendously. You know, it's a great painting. And Juan de Pareja in it looks so wide-eyed. I mean, just the openness of his face, and you know, people reportedly said, oh, it looks exactly like him, and so it was a marvel of, you know, perfect representation. And then, you know, come to find out that Pareja is also a painter and is known for his painting, The Calling of St. Matthew, in which he did a thing which must have been common for painters, to put himself in the painting. And when you see him in the painting, his representation of himself is so not like Velázquez's representation. I mean, he's literally looking much shrewder. You know, his eyes are narrowed as if to say, I know more than you think I do. I mean, of course, that's at least how I would see it, because having been the daughter of someone who sees me the way he sees me, and what we struggle as children, you know, of parents, to try to assert our own identity, that bumps up often against with how others see us, how our elders, how our parents see us. I know that I must have been taken with just those two images, just the different way that Pareja's eyes were represented, depending on who was doing it. And of course, by starting to write about that, I realized that in his story is everything about mine. You know, that he was, you know, the son of a black woman, you know, sort of taken away and sold into slavery, given to, you know, to be in the studio of a man who was good to him in many ways, you know, that he was able to apprentice himself to. And so you have, you know, Pareja as an artist becoming a painter like his father, and me becoming a poet like my father. So all the things were there, even as I wasn't quite seeing it like that until the poem got written. And so I began to see it as something about the nature of fatherhood, the nature of inheritance, apprenticeship, seeing oneself differently than you're seen by someone else. But also, even in Pareja's story, the absence of his mother, that loss that still, I imagine, haunted him the rest of his days.
Yeah. Would you read that poem?
It might be. Should I finish there, because I think it's a little longer?
Okay.
Is it?
Or even if you just want to read one, maybe the final section, or
I'll read maybe just a couple of sections, or the first and the last.
Okay, and then I'll share. I have more questions, but I'll share.
Okay, I'll just read let's see. Yeah, I know the ones to read. Okay, so these are just a few of the sections from Thrall, which is in the voice of Juan de Pareja, 1670. He was not my father, though he might have been. I came to him the mulatto son of a slave woman, just that, as if it took only my mother to make me a mulatto, meaning any white man could be my father. In his shop, bound to the muller, I ground his colors, my hands dusted black with fired bone, stained blue and flecked with glass, my nails edged vermilion as if my fingertips bled. In this way, just as I turned the pages of his books, I meant to touch everything he did. How intently at times could he fix his keen eye upon me, though only once did he fix me in paint. My color a study, my eyes wide as I faced him, a lace collar at my shoulders, as though I'd been born noble, the yoke of my birth gone from my neck. In his hand a long brush to keep him far from the canvas, far from it as I was. The distance between us doubled that he could observe me twice, stand closer to what he made. For years I looked to it as one looks into a mirror. And so, in the calling of St. Matthew, I painted my own likeness, a freeman in the house of customs waiting to pay my duty. In my hand an answer, a slip of paper, my signature on it, Juan de Pareja, 1661, Velázquez, 1 year gone. Behind me, upright on a shelf, a forged platter, luminous as an aureole just beyond my head, my face turned to look out from the scene, a self-portrait. To make it, I looked at how my master saw me. Then I narrowed my eyes. Now, at the bright edge of sleep, mother. She comes back to me as sound, her voice in the echo of bird call, a single syllable again and again my name, Juan, 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 or a bit of song that, waking, I cannot grasp.
Thank you. I'd love to share this opportunity to ask Natasha questions with all of you. So. And I'd even share the microphone if that would be helpful too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You know, well, actually, since I've been at the library,